Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Please consult a healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed are our own and do not represent those of our workplaces. Listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content does not establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right. So we're back. Eric, you want to introduce what we are diving into today?
Yeah, I think it's one that we're all probably noticing right now in this season. We are in the middle of a lovely, I don't want to call it a snowpocalypse, but a lot of snow, a lot of cold here in the great Southwest Ohio area. So we're going to talk about the seasonal effect on some of the mental health symptoms. So one caveat we will just throw out at the beginning is we're wanting to explore this and discuss this today, but not to say that if you feel kind of stir crazy after a day of snow, like many people did in Southwest Ohio, that is a mild salsa to what we're going to get into today because we're talking about seasonal affective disorder, which is like clinical levels of things that are like lasting and consistent. So more than the initial few days. So I just throw that out at the very beginning because I don't want anyone who struggles with seasonal affective disorder to feel like we're minimizing the impact that that has. And so I know we've both, Tiffany, worked with many people who have been impacted by this. So I just want to throw that out from the get-go. And if there's any disclaimers or add-ons you'd like to put out there, Tiffany.
Yeah, I think something else we're gonna work to interweave into this is the intersection of SAD and PTSD and some of those trauma symptoms that it can exacerbate during this time of year.
Yes. So right off the gate, so seasonal affective disorder does not have to be in the winter. It is more common in the winter for most seasons, but it is not the only time. So there is a spring, summer version of seasonal affective disorder. But since we are doing this in the winter, we're going to highlight a little bit more of the winter depression. So
Mhm.
I just want to read some of the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder: a persistent low mood, a loss of pleasure or interest in normal everyday activities. And so it would be different than like, I have a sourdough starter right now. You guys can ask me how that's going later. It's not going great. But it wouldn't be like, oh, I've baked 30 loaves of bread and now I'm not interested in that hobby. It would be, oh, you normally enjoy your coffee every day and you just stop liking coffee. Or you like video games, you stop liking video games. So I just want to specify that because sometimes I think people don't understand that criteria as well. Irritability, feelings of despair, guilt, and worthlessness, feeling lethargic, lacking energy, sleeping a lot during the day, sleeping longer than normal and finding it hard to get up, cravings of carbs and gaining weight, difficulty concentrating, and decreased sex drive. Anything that just sticks out to you, Tiffany, when we're talking about the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder?
Mm, yes, the fatigue and the desire to sleep all the time. Like, I feel that one, like, personally. Like, I'm always like, "Oh, it's cold, I just want a burrito," and, like, sleep and wake up when it's warm.
Yeah, I do think it can be easy to feel the less energy this time of year, at least in Ohio. It's very
Mhm.
cold. It feels like there's more effort. So, I think it can do a lot of different um, pieces. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that solutions to this are very like interesting, and so it's becoming more and more understood, like some of the symptoms and ways of managing. But one of the theories is like a lack of sunlight can impact the brain and the production of different chemicals. So like whether it's melatonin or serotonin or just the like our natural body rhythms and how that gets thrown off when it's dark at 5 o'clock and sunny at 7. So there's just different like but it's like it's interesting because like I don't think that's like we could go to get our blood drawn and be like, oh hey, like you're having high sugar. Like isn't really a straightforward test, at least that I'm aware of, where it can be like you definitively have this. We could screen for symptoms, but there isn't maybe at this time a go in, go out, and then for sure this is what this is.
Mhm. Yeah, and something to keep in mind is like the brain itself has a response to trauma and also environmental stressors like reduced sunlight, and that is like deeply rooted in the body's hormonal and nervous systems. So both like past trauma experiences and reduced sunlight can trigger changes in how the brain processes stress, emotions, and regulation, which can lead to like overlapping symptoms of SAD and like trauma if you have both of those co-occurring at the same time.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess it would depend on the type of treatment or maybe like where it's rooted from, but obviously we are a trauma-informed trauma podcast, so a lot of things can increase the risk of seasonal affective disorder, but being exposed to trauma is one of those factors. And also, just if you think about a scale and how things tip the balance, like being exposed to traumatic experiences just simply tips the scale for a lot of different health outcomes. Seasonal affective disorder uh, is one of those outcomes.
Yeah. And like to continue on like that, like sunlight, it helps regulate serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter associated with mood stability, and reducing sunlight during winter decreases our serotonin production, which can worsen not only, depression, anxiety symptoms, but trauma symptoms as well. As we experience longer nights, the brain produces more melatonin, which is our hormone that regulates sleep, which can lead to that excessive fatigue, lethargy, and disrupted sleep-wake cycles that we see, um, which can then in turn like disrupt our circadian rhythm, which heavily relies on light cues from the environment. And it can misalign those rhythms, causing, sleep disturbances, mood swings, difficulty concentrating, a whole host of fun, swirling, not great things related to just sunlight.
Yeah, no, I mean you're the expert on that. I'd stay away from getting into all the neuros. I know about it, but I'm like, it's definitely not my preferred hat to lean in. But I do think it's very interesting, and I think it kind of leads us to maybe some of the different treatment options for someone that maybe is experiencing. So, uh, one is we're alluding a lot to is the light. So there are some different lights. You may have heard them called happy lights, depression lights, or like exposure. Uh, I've screened on Amazon. They have some as cheap as like $20 right now. When they first came out, it was I think like I'm thinking 60, $80, but there's a lot of different options. But the idea is like if you're not getting as much natural sunlight, uh that can kind of simulate exposure to sunlight and help with some of those chemicals or just even the rhythm of having some of it. So I have personally used one, Tiffany. I find it to be somewhat helpful for me. Like kind of just giving myself that 20 minutes. But I mean, obviously, we're not saying everyone needs to do this. But have you had it? Do you know of anyone that's done this or used the light before as like an option to combat some of the seasonal affective symptoms?
So I don't personally know anyone that at least has admitted or mentioned to me they use it. I have recommended it to a couple of people because I've heard like on baseline research level it's effective. Like I think if I remember correctly, and if I'm quoting this wrong, people please feel free to correct me, but they did a study in Alaska and they found that it significantly helped reduce depression symptoms because of I forget how many days of just like darkness they have. So where they don't actually have light at all. And it was helpful.
No, the 40 days of night somewhere in Alaska. I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
that is where some of this got started because they were noticing some of the increased depression and then drastic like rhythm changes that can happen. So yeah, I find it interesting. I think also a lot of, as we know, for a lot of coping skills, some of them help some people, some of them aren't as helpful. So that may not be a solve for a lot of people. Another option is just like lifestyle measures. So just trying to get outside, exercising, and managing stress levels can be helpful. It is brutally, oppressively cold, and also like there is something we get from that connection with nature. And Tiffany and I haven't gotten into this as much yet, but there's like some new therapy treatments that are like next level with grounding. Like, and it's all about connecting with the earth and feeling the energy of the earth and like literally being barefoot on the earth and connecting. I don't know enough to talk about it at this moment, but there's a lot of shifts happening in therapy and treatments for some things. But I think almost innately we kind of know there's something about connecting with nature that is very healing and therapeutic. And I think maybe that's
Yeah.
in there for all of us, or we're born with that, all of us at some level.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it's I don't know if it's professionally called walking therapy, but like that where people have that they offer like to walk outside in a park and do therapy. I've heard that like can be really helpful for people to be grounded when doing some trauma processing as well.
That's very interesting. Yeah, the walk and talks. There's a lot of things shifting for therapy, isn't there?
Yeah.
Speaking of therapy, therapy is another treatment for seasonal affective disorder. So, like whether that's CBT, talk therapy, narrative therapy, there's so many different options, but some people just benefit from having that support for a bit to work through some of these symptoms, find ways of managing them. Uh, and another option is medication. So if it gets to a level where it's, really impacting day-to-day quality of life, that may be an option to consider. Or as you're a person kind of looking through like what are you able to do right now? Is it therapy? Is it meds? Is it all of the things? Is it some of the things? But that's a very personal decision that you probably need to check in with your counselor or prescriber about. And also just being honest about what can you manage. So not saying, oh, I only have 20 minutes a day, so yeah, I'll be able to do all these things. Like, that may not be realistic to be able to do therapy, all these lifestyle changes at the same time.
Yeah. Well, also, EMDR and somatic therapies can be super helpful if you have compounded trauma, like with the seasonal affective disorder, to help process and get you more grounded and connected, rather than just doing CBT for that. Not to like throw CBT under the bus because I use it quite often, but like it can be
Like, yeah, no,
it can
keep
be
going.
unhelpful at times when you have a lot of compounded trauma.
Yeah. I agree. I think all of the modalities would be much better understood if we as therapists could just say that they're all great tools if you're using them in the right spot and the right way. But like they're not great for everything. Similar to like a saw is not helpful for every job in your house, neither is a hammer. Like, but there's times where a saw is great or a hammer is great or a drill. But I think sometimes, if we're calling ourselves out, Tiffany, like we have our lens, how we see things clinically and how we approach things. And then sometimes we gather with like-minded people. And then like we kind of like, whether we intend to or not, become a club of like, well, I'm an EMDR therapist. This is what we do, right? And it can be really tough. And I know that I've had a lot of patients sometimes not understand, like, well, my therapist didn't want to do this or that, like
Mhm.
there could be other reasons, but they're all great tools. It's just, do we know how to use them and are they the right tool for the job? I think, so, there's times EMDR is perfect and awesome and such a great fit, times for CBT or other ones, but you do find people who kind of I don't know, throw down on, well, the way I've been trained is best and what I do is best. I mean, or else why would they be doing it, right? No one's really intending not to do their best.
Yeah. It can be a nasty like fight club out there when it comes to modalities, when it's really like there's a lot of people on the planet and like they're all gonna benefit from different things, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's some therapy bingo cards that I thought were funny. I was seeing around the end of 2024 of like how to get therapists in a bunch, and
Uh-oh.
EMDR was one of them, and nervous system, and one of the other ones. Well, I'm a substance use counselor. Is harm reduction. If you want to see people get a little spicy, just but I think if it is therapy, it has to be evidence based, and we know that everything we've talked about so far has evidence supporting it. So, if you're a consumer or someone seeking therapy or services, if you know maybe it's not working great for you, but as long as your counselor is sticking to things that are evidence based, like they're within the lines of like what is helpful for therapy. But exploring what's helpful, customizing it, that's not just the therapist's job, that is also the patient and person coming to therapy's job, because that's how you're going to get a great experience, is if you customize it. If it's kind of generic feeling, it, well, not that it's all on the person, but like that's a great comment to make in therapy. I would love if a client was like, I don't know if I this feels kind of stale. I That's a great conversation, because then I know we're about to have a super real one about, okay, let's get into what's real, about what's going on.
Yeah.
One of the other things, just when we're thinking about symptoms, is like late fall, early winter, sunnier days of spring and summer. If we're thinking of the winter subtype, tends to fade a little bit.
Mhm.
But they also may start mild and become more severe as the season progresses. So it just may be something to make a note of, is like, as it's really cold, I'm just thinking for a lot of people, probably the snowed in week and all of the time and less ability to get out and do things. I'm sure that was really hard for a lot of people, and probably triggered some of it or made some of it worse. Um, but I do just like to kind of make sure that there is a spring and summer type. It is not just fall and winter. And I just keep saying it because, like, I didn't think that was a thing, being honest. I graduated with a master's degree and I thought I was very smart, but there's a lot of people that have this show up in spring and summer in the same way. And if you're on here being like, how could someone not like the summer and spring after all? It just is, it's not something like people are choosing, if that makes sense. Just like they're not choosing to feel how they're feeling in the winter. But it just seems like there's more understanding because maybe we more relate to the cold and going. But for some people, that's overwhelming, and it is the same symptoms we're talking about, that look like depression symptoms. The other thing, just being trauma informed, there are some different disorders that are maybe more lifelong disorders, or disorders that don't fade, like bipolar, or some of the different responses. And so those things also have their own cycles. And if you're thinking about seasonal changes, that has a huge impact for most people on some of their mental health symptoms, and PTSD, the like. There's very strong links, and like, so that's one of the things I know Tiffany and I, as therapists, we work through with our patients, is exploring some of those things and how are they managing some of the shifts. Not because we can plan for everything, but that's a pretty known stressor for a lot of people, because it brings about change, shift, and changes like that autopilot level for everyone.
Yeah. And like the combined effects of like that seasonal stress, like especially if you have underlying trauma, can really intensify mental health challenges. You can have heightened amygdala responses from reduced sunlight, which can amplify feelings of fear, anxiety, and depression. At this time of year, we tend to see a lot of people who have increased cortisol levels, especially if you have an underlying trauma. It primes your body for heightened stress responses. And then you have social isolation, financial strain, less physical activity during the winter can just pound on that increased cortisol, leading to burnout, emotional isolation, all of those things. And then it tends to weaken our coping mechanisms. If you have underlying trauma, it can already impair the brain's ability to regulate emotions and stress effectively. And then during the winter, we talked about those serotonin levels dropping and melatonin rising. It becomes even harder to engage in productive and proactive coping skills because you're like, everything's wonky.
Wow. Yeah, I'm excited we're talking about this, and if anyone does feel comfortable, like letting us know what their seasonal symptoms look like. Obviously, we're not going to share that publicly in any way, but if you are comfortable sharing like what it's like for you, Tiffany and I always try to be mindful that we are not the only nervous systems and people with the ways things show up and are challenged. We'd love to hear like your we'll de-identify those thoughts or just kind of aggregate the feedback, but there's lots of different ways this can show up for people. But just being mindful, being aware for yourself. So this maybe just a practical takeaway of, how is it showing up? What's going on? When did this start? What's going on? And one of the challenges we haven't mentioned yet is that none of this goes on in a vacuum. So you may also have the holidays hitting full sweep while you're having your seasonal effect. And so sometimes people don't connect the two. But I just have empathy for people that none of us are in a vacuum. And so, if your kids are sick, or if you're dealing with like some healthcare trauma, or if you're dealing with wounds from trauma, there's just so many pieces. So I do think it could be hard to tell if this was a piece if you have four or five other pieces going on at the same time.
Oh, yeah. And something that like I want to stress because there are individuals, not to like throw anyone under the bus, that still have this mentality or a fear of like talking about it and like processing through it in a healthy way. And I just want to stress the fact that like chronic exposure to trauma, when left unchecked along with seasonal stressors, can like drastically change your brain. It can cause neuroinflammation, which is just when ongoing stress increases inflammation in the brain, which is very strongly linked to depression and other mood disorders. Um, it can also cognitively impair you. Reduced activity in your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus can impair your memory, your focus, and your ability to process and house new information. And then it really fucks with your emotional regulation. Repeated triggers of stress responses makes it harder to regulate emotions, leading to heightened anxiety and depression episodes and just leaving you feeling as stressed out as fuck.
Mm, well, sad. I Is there anything else, Tiffany, that you're just like, okay, like this is something I wanted to share in this conversation? I don't want us to feel shorted on anything, but is there anything else that kind of comes to mind?
I think something too that can be helpful for us to talk about and normalize is that like sad can impact your work productivity.
Ooh, in what way?
Yeah. So like seasonal changes influence our focus, they influence our motivation, they influence our professional life, they influence our social interactions. Like if it's cold outside and there's 10 inches of snow, you're probably not very likely to like want to go out and want to interact and you're potentially cold and miserable. Or if you're on the other end of the spectrum, maybe you're like, "Oh my gosh, this snow is awesome." But maybe your family and friends and social network don't feel the same way about snow. It can create a lot of like interpersonal struggles that like end up impacting your work productivity. If you're not feeling supported or taken care of, like that impacts your motivation to want to work.
Hmm. And if you're someone that finds a lot of value in the work, like almost all folks do, that could be, I think, really challenging to acknowledge that speed change for a lot of people and like where that's coming from for them.
Oh yeah. And on top of that, like around like November, December, like that holiday season, like it's also crunch time for a lot of businesses. They're trying to make deadlines and hit productivity marks and they're putting more pressure on you and on top of the holiday pressure and like the seasonal changes, like it's a lot of stuff happening all at one time.
Mm. There is a lot that comes with the end of the year, which is why I do think maybe there is more understanding um for the cold season, like maybe that's why there's just more. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But it does feel like there's just something to it. I don't know. Just feels like there's something there for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. So, one other thing I kind of wanted to touch on, and I think this might be a little bit hopefully it's a little bit in your wheelhouse. I could be wrong, but looking at the intersection of SAD and PTSD and the unique set of challenges that can create for individuals.
Yes. I do think people with PTSD are more susceptible to SAD for some of the different symptoms that are already um, there. I do think another challenge is that some of these symptoms look the same, and so maybe the level of them is not always understood or appreciated. Um, but that's a good. I guess there's always more that could be thought about or connected. But I also know that you do a lot um, with this, Tiffany. So, like, is there any kind of specific symptom you were thinking of that shows up like the most?
Yeah, so the common overlaps I end up encountering is a depressed mood, the fatigue and low energy, that social withdrawal, and that difficulty concentrating. Like those tend to be like so overlap sometimes it can be really hard to manage one without also addressing the other.
Yeah, I do think things are a lot more connected than we all like to admit sometimes. And so I do think that there is a challenge for some people like admitting some of it. So I do think there does have to be some acknowledgement that I do think some people sometimes are like, I don't want to say they're anti doing that, but it is hard, I think, sometimes to connect like what's going on and where it's coming from for some people.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know if that also is more of like what you've noticed a bit, Tiffany, for some people.
Yeah, yeah. I think too, something that when doing my notes that really stuck out to me was that hypervigilance, and it's like that common symptom of PTSD, that constant scanning of environment for potential threats, and how like that's also like it's not necessarily a symptom of SAD, but SAD itself can intensify that symptom. That reduced daylight and darker settings can like make individuals feel less secure, increasing perception of potential uh, dangers. Um, there's that fatigue and large lethargy that's associated with SAD that can limit a person's ability to manage their hypervigilance, which can, heighten anxiety feelings. And then both PTSD and SAD activate your brain's stress response. That's basically the flight, fright, or freeze zone. And that persistent nature of the state can lead to physical symptoms like muscle tension, rapid heartbeat, tummy struggles, like all of those things can like become prevalent if you're just overwhelmed and can't regulate your nervous system.
I could see why that would be problematic. And I guess maybe one other symptom I think of is if your automatic autopilot is
Mhm.
challenged or frustrated, that also is going to be uh, just problematic for a lot of different reasons because then you're also not going to be more at rest. You're going to feel a little more on edge just simply because it's new and different and not what you're used to experiencing. Um, yeah, there's just a lot of things I think you could. I don't want to say you could just go on and on, but there is a lot of there's a lot of ways that this can connect or overlap. And so I do think, this is I don't want to say our first attempt, but it is one of our attempts to try to bring some of these conversations to the surface because if you're not having these conversations and exploring the connections, I don't think these are connections that you just make on your own. or are able to get without maybe intentionally trying to seek or find them.
Yeah. Our main goal is to just help you recognize that trauma and sad, individually and together, can interact and encourage symptoms to become unmanageable. And that's like no fault of like a person's attempts to like manage symptoms. It's just a lot happens during the winter months, and like education is the best way to empower individuals to adopt more proactive strategies to support mental health, challenges and struggles during that really impactful seasonal change.
Well, thanks, Tiffany. I feel like I learned something today.
Yeah. Hopefully. My goal was to not go too into the neuroscience, but I like the brain. It's
No,
fascinating.
I mean, I think that's helpful to have that framework when you're bringing some of this stuff up.
Hmm. Well, I think that sums up kind of like my thought points for the day. I don't know if you have anything else you want to round us out for, or.
No, I just want to maybe just thank everyone again for listening and joining us in some of these discussions. I know they can be a little uncomfortable and a little stressful at times. So we just appreciate everyone kind of working with us and helping us keep growing each time.
Yeah, and also we do have YouTube now, so you can come check out our potentially lovely or not lovely faces, depending on your face preference.
Hopefully we are that, and if we're not, I don't know if I want to know.
Ah, but yeah, until next time, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.